A year ago today, I was in Ukraine celebrating the 30th anniversary of Ukrainian independence. I had just taken my ashes of my father to Sambir, just west of Lviv, to bury him. My father passed away in late 2020. He wanted to be buried back in Ukraine. So I took his ashes with me to Ukraine to coincide with the 30th anniversary of independence, gave him a burial in his hometown of Sambir, and then attended the celebrations in Kiev for 3 decades of Ukrainian independence. And here we are a year later, Ukraine is at war. Why is Ukraine at war? The reasons are relatively simple, but you'd be surprised how many people in the West didn't get it and still don't get it. Most Western academics who deal with Russia still can't get their heads around what's going on, because they always saw Ukraine as a kind of an appendage of Russia. So the idea that these two countries are fighting it out to the death, as it were, as it looks like sometimes, is beyond their comprehension. The reasons for the war are Putin has been obsessed with Ukraine for nearly his entire over 2 decades in power. That obsession has grown since the annexation of Crimea and invasion of the Donbass region of East Ukraine in 2014. And the sources of this began approximately after the Orange Revolution in the mid-2000s. Then what happened in Russia were 2 rehabilitations, if you want to call it that, 2 cults. The first cult and rehabilitation was of white Russian emigres. Their remains of white Russian emigre writers and generals were brought back for reburial in Russia. Putin supervised this, and more importantly, their writings were republished and distributed around schools, TV, journalists, and in the army. Very important. This coincided, therefore, with 15 years, the beginning of 15 years of dehumanization of Ukrainians in the Russian media and in Russian political discourse. Genocide doesn't just happen out of nowhere. For a long period of time, prior to the Holodomor, and prior to the Holocaust, and prior to the current genocide in Ukraine, there has always been a period of dehumanization, whereby it makes it easier for those committing the genocide to torture, kill, and rape. Because they're not human beings, whether they're Ukrainians and Poles in the 1930s, Jews and Romani in World War II, or Ukrainians today. They're not human beings. They can be tortured, raped, and murdered. This dehumanization of Ukrainians, which has been taking place for such a long period of time, completely escaped Western academia and actually most government policymakers. With the rehabilitation of white Russian emigre views of Ukraine, what that led to was a stagnation of Russian nationalism away from the Soviet understanding of Ukrainians to a pre-Soviet. What that meant was Russians began to see Ukrainians as just a branch of the Russian nation. The term is Pan-Russian Nation, Общерусский народ, where there are great, little, and white Russians. There is no separate Ukrainian nation, and Ukraine is a fake state. So we're back to pre-Soviet times, because even, and I say this as an anti-communist, anti-Soviet person, even in the Soviet Union, there was a recognition of Ukrainians as a separate people to Russians, and a recognition of the Ukrainian language, even though there was Russification. Of course, they always emphasized Ukrainians and Russians were brothers, but they were separate. And Ukraine was actually a founding member of the UN in 1945, because Joseph Stalin got 3 seats at the UN. The second rehabilitation is that of this cult of the great, so-called Great Patriotic War, i.e. only commemorating from 41 to 45, ignoring the Nazi-Soviet pact. And together with that, this emphasis on any Ukrainian who doesn't agree with the Russian viewpoint, the Kremlin viewpoint, is a Nazi. So a return to this Soviet propaganda against so-called Nazis and nationalists, fascists, etc. So these two cults were growing at the same time as Stalin became a new cult as well. What Putin has promoted is a cult of Stalin as the generalissimo who conquered Eastern Europe, built a nuclear superpower, which the West was scared about, and also at the same time downplaying, ignoring, denying Stalin's crimes against humanity. Could you imagine 3 decades after World War II, an ex-Gestapo officer coming to power in Germany and promoting a cult of Adolf Hitler? Well, 3 decades after, or 2 decades after the USSR collapsed, a former KGB officer came to power in Russia and promoted the cult of Stalin. So all of these developments in Russia were the exact opposite of what was taking place in Ukraine, and obviously, inevitably, there's going to be a clash. This came to the head when Yanukovych fled from power in 2014 and Russia invaded Crimea. So, why did he invade now? Well, I think a number of factors. One strong rumor is that Putin isn't very healthy, so he needs to do what he wants to do quickly. He doesn't believe he has much time left on Earth. And Putin has believed since 2012, when he became president again, that he's going to go into Russian history as the gatherer of Russian lands. By Russian, this means Ukrainians, Belarusians, and Russians and Ukrainians. Now, what this means is that Crimea has been taken back. Belarus was taken back in 2020. It's become a de facto Russian satellite state, colony, and the big prize is Ukraine. You can't have this Ruski Mir, this Russian world, being built as the core of a new Eurasian empire without Ukraine and without Kiev. Also, I think in Russia they had given up on any kind of attempt to pressurize Zelensky. They'd given up on Poroshenko before, but even with Zelensky, they'd given up on the idea that somehow with a mixture of diplomatic and military pressure, they can get Zelensky to capitulate and agree to Russian demands around some kind of peace deal. So all of that as well was spurred along by Zelensky adopting in many ways a more radical approach to pro-Russian forces than even Poroshenko had, because he banned 4 pro-Russian TV channels in 2021 and imposed criminal charges against Viktor Medvedchuk, who is seen by Putin as de facto his kind of governor of Ukraine. And Putin is the godfather to Medvedchuk's daughter. So all of these factors were coming to a head. Putin invaded in February 24th, exactly six months ago. But of course, Russia invaded on the premise of stereotypes and myths that it had developed itself over the last 15 years, which were completely out of touch with reality. They invaded with 175,000 troops. Sounds a lot, but it's minuscule for a country the size of Ukraine and for a country with 400,000 security forces. You need 2 to 3 times as many invading forces as defending forces. So Russia should have had something like 800,000 at the minimum. If you compare this to Czechoslovakia in 1968, Czechoslovakia then had 10 million population and 250,000 Warsaw Pact troops invaded. So they invaded with less than the Warsaw Pact in 68. The reason why the number of troops was so small was because of Russian arrogance, believing that these little Russians were dying to be liberated and they would greet Russian forces with flowers. Completely not true. I didn't believe that. But let's be frank here. Many in the West believe that as well. Many in the West, because most of these so-called Western experts on the Russian military are quite Russophile, quite Russocentric, they also believed, like the Kremlin did, that Ukraine would fold within 2 or 3 days, Zelensky would run away, and it would be all over. Same view as Russians. Russian soldiers heading for Kiev were actually issued with parade uniforms. They wanted to do a parade on the Khreshchatyk like Hitler did in Paris in 1940. That's how arrogant they were. It didn't turn out like that. But the problem with that was that weapons from the West only began to come later. Because, because the West believed that Ukraine would quickly fold, they only envisaged supporting a partisan movement in Ukraine, not a full-scale war. And that delayed the arrival of weapons for many weeks. Now the flood of weapons is happening on a major scale, and Ukraine is turning the tide, but that took a while. Russia miscalculated, therefore. Miscalculated because I don't know of any Russian experts in Moscow who understand Ukraine or see it for what it is. To this day, I don't see them like that. And Russia miscalculated because it expected the West to be as weak-kneed on sanctions as it was in 2014, and especially in 2008 when Russia invaded Georgia. That was also wrong. This time the West was united in its sanctions, and these sanctions were tough, i.e. Iranian-style sanctions, which was not the case in 2014. That means that Russia has been on the defensive. It was kicked out of Kiev, kicked out of northeast Ukraine, Chernihiv, Sumy, Kharkiv, and then in turn refocused on the Donbass and on southern Ukraine. It got lucky in Kherson, which ironically is the most Ukrainian language-speaking region of this so-called Russian-speaking area of the south and east. It got lucky there because of treason from local SBU, Security Service of Ukraine officials, which were, by the way, put in place by President Zelensky. And hence the three bridges going across the Dnipro to the oblast center of Kherson were not blown up as they should have been at the time when Russia invaded from Crimea. They have been blown up now, but that's a bit too late. From my point of view, the key area of this battle, and I think the foot is now on the Ukrainian side. I think Ukrainians have the upper hand for many reasons. I think primarily because Russia doesn't have the manpower. This supposedly second most powerful army in the world has been a Potemkin army. It's a fake army. Russia's highly corrupt. It's been called a mafia state for the last 12 years, and a lot of the money was stolen, not put into the Russian military. The reforms didn't get anywhere, so there's still a very Soviet army. So, for example, they don't have an NCO system. Their system of command is rigidly hierarchical, which is terrible in this kind of fluid warfare. Whereas Ukrainian forces have been trained to NATO standards over the last 8 years, so far more flexible and far more able to function in a very fluid environment. And Ukraine has NCOs, Russia doesn't. Very important linkage between senior officers and lower command. So Russia doesn't have the manpower. Why? You think, well, this is a huge country. Surely it has the manpower. Well, not necessarily, because Putin's in this bind. On the one hand, he can't withdraw from Ukraine, because to withdraw would mean the end of Putin. I mean, there's no honor amongst thieves in Moscow. It would be seen as defeatist if he withdrew. But on the other hand, he can't go for the other option, which is declare war in Ukraine and do a full mobilization. That would be ironically unpopular. Polls show that would be unpopular. So on the one hand, you have a large number of Russians who say they support the war. Now, remember, this is a dictatorship, so you don't always get honest opinion polls. People are afraid to give their honest viewpoint. But a huge number of those don't actually want to go and fight. So I saw an opinion poll from a Russian newspaper recently where something like 2/3 didn't want to go and fight and only about 25% did. So that's quite low. The reasons for that will grow because the information about very high Russian casualties, and we're talking about something like 40+ thousand dead, plus usually the number of wounded is 2 to 3 times higher. So this means that within 6 months, Russia has had far more, something like 4 times more casualties than in Afghanistan over 10 years. That information is coming back to Russia. That doesn't make many people want to go and fight, especially as well because of the way Russian soldiers are treated by their officers. They're treated like shit. I mean, there's no other way to describe it. The kind of information you get coming out about the food that they served, the medical equipment, the fact that their dead Russian soldiers just left to rot, they're not collected by the army. I've seen photographs of medical kits issued to Russian soldiers from 1978, which means they're out of date completely. They're useless. Russian soldiers are issued with out-of-date food rations. So nobody really wants to go and fight in this war. It's not really a popular war. So hence you have this fiction of a special military operation. But a special military operation sounds like a quick operation sort of against terrorists and not something that will last for years. So Russia has that difficulty. Plus Russian arms are not very good. One impact of this war is that the Russian arms industry has collapsed. Not only from sanctions, but because orders abroad are being cancelled. When foreign countries like Philippines, India, and elsewhere have seen how these Russian arms are reacting, they don't want them anymore. It's the country which will get a massive boost in its market sales after this war is Turkey's Bayraktar drones. It's going to go through the roof. Hence why they give free drones when there's crowdfunding to pay for them, which is what makes it even more surprising why Canadian Ukrainians haven't crowdfunded this, because they would get a free drone and they could use the money for something else, humanitarian or medical or whatever, because every time people have crowdfunded for these drones, Bayraktar has given them for free. So the Russian side is kind of reeling from all of this, and we have now report of large numbers of attacks in the Crimea, which we never expected, including demolishing military airfields, attacking Black Sea Fleet headquarters. One of the ways they're doing this was first developed by Azerbaijan 3 years ago in its war against Armenia, in using pilotless airplanes as kamikaze planes with weapons. These are directed into their military objective by special forces on the ground. And that seems to be what is taking place in Crimea. Ukraine special forces are on the ground and they're directing these, they're militarized unmanned airplanes. That's the way they're described. Not very expensive, so they're not as expensive as Bayraktar drones. They're about something up to $10,000. Quite small, relatively small, and they're meant to be destroyed. So Ukraine has got the wind behind it, as it were. The key area, in my view, has always been southern Ukraine, not the Donbass. I don't believe that Kiev is now still going to be under threat, except from, of course, bomb missile attacks, of which there have been 3,000, which is incredible to believe. Why is the south important? Because Russia's goal is both ideological, to recreate this mythical new Russia, the Tsarist term for southern eastern Ukraine, but also, more importantly, to cut Ukraine off from the Black Sea. The idea was to go, of course, as far as Odessa. That didn't happen. They were blocked at Mykolaiv Oblast. But denying Ukraine access to the Black Sea means, from a Russian perspective, that Ukraine's economy will be heavily suffering from that, and that would maybe make it more difficult for the country to survive. So hence there's been a lot of speculation about when there's going to be an offensive to retake back Kherson. It seems that Ukrainians, I think correctly so, and I think this is the advice they're getting from Western military experts, is not to rush this. What they're doing instead is 3 stages. There's a lot of Ukrainian troops in Britain training, and I'm sure the brigades which will be created from that will be the spearhead of any potential offensive. They're being trained by British, Scandinavian, and Polish trainers. I'm not sure if there are any American or Canadians there. So that's one aspect of this. The second is, as I've mentioned, attacks to sort of destroy that psychological sense of security amongst both the Russian military and the Russian public. There's a mass exodus of Russian public from Crimea. So that's one, secondly. And thirdly, to destroy lots of Russian arms depots. I mean, these American HIMARS, Russia has nothing to compare them with, and Russian air defenses can't knock them down. And so they've been destroying Russian arms depots in both the Donbass and southern Ukraine, and also knocking out transportation of weapons by train. They've been destroyed. And thirdly, destroying the 3 bridges across the Dnipro. So Russian soldiers in the oblast center of Kherson are now isolated. They're cut off. The only way that any supplies can get to them is by dinghy and some sort of artificial pontoons, which I'm sure again will be destroyed. So that is going to come. If and when, and I believe they will be successful in retaking back Kherson, I think that's going to be the beginning of the end of Putin. Putin cannot survive that kind of military defeat. Once Kherson goes, then Russian control over the south becomes extremely weak, and Russia only really controls one oblast. It controls Kherson and southern Zaporizhia, not all of Zaporizhia Oblast. And then you've got the Donbass, which is Mariupol. Also, it means that Russia no longer gets in the Crimea supplies of fresh water. Russia deliberately tried to occupy Kherson because that's the source of fresh water supplies to Crimea. Once Ukraine gets that back, that creates the repeat problem that Russia had over the last 8 years. Putin, therefore, is going to be in a very dire situation if he is defeated in the south of Ukraine. And that creates, I think, potentially problems in Moscow, because there's, of course, no honor amongst thieves. What this all means is that the war won't end tomorrow. The war will continue as long as Putin is in power. Putin is a dog with a bone. He's obsessed with Ukraine. He can't give up his fight in Ukraine because that's the end of Putin. So the only way that this can potentially end is with a Ukrainian victory that maybe then leads to a knock-on effect of Putin being removed from power, killed, whatever. Nobody cares about that, how it happens. The impact of all of this is like 1,000 home goals scored by Putin if he was playing a game of football in his own home goal. Everything that he expected has turned out in the opposite way. Ukraine now is more united than it's ever been in its history, probably, or at least in the last 100 years. Gone are the old days when sort of a radical pro-Russian position was only found in Western Ukraine. Now Eastern and Southern Ukrainians have the same views as Western Ukrainians. Maybe not as high percentage terms, but basically the same. Positive feelings about Russia in Ukraine now are only 3%. 3%. I mean, that's basically, that can be called a statistical error. It's no longer, so and that means that East Ukrainians have the same views as West Ukrainians. Why is that surprising? It's not really, because most of the people who have been killed and tortured and deported and raped are Eastern Ukrainians. Putin has attacked the very people who previously had some kind of sympathy or linkage to Russia, Eastern Ukrainians. I mean, Mariupol was a city that was controlled by Donetsk oligarch Akhmetov, and which voted on his command for the pro-Russian opposition bloc. I'm sure it won't be voting for that anymore when it returns to Ukraine. So that's also had impacts on other areas. For example, attitudes to the Ukrainian language. The Russian language is now seen as a language of a military aggressor. People are turning away from the Russian language. Of course, this doesn't happen overnight, but it certainly will lead to, and it's already led to, a growing number of people who are becoming bilingual. So if you were a Russian speaker before, you are now classifying yourself as a bilingual person, and bilingualism is always the transition to something else. So from bilingualism, you'll become Ukrainian speaking, with of course emphasizing your children first. Ukraine is now in the throes, and this will grow even more after the war is ended, in a process of de-Russification. You can call it decolonization, de-Russification. It can be also viewed as the second stage of what has taken place since 2014. Then we had decommunization, desovietization, a product of 4 laws adopted in April of 2015. Things like removal of all communist monuments in Ukraine, commemorating the end of World War II on May 8th, not May 9th, like in Russia, and also commemorating World War II from 39 to 45, not the Great Patriotic War, 41 to 45. Declaring that Nazism and communism are both equally treacherous and criminal. All of these are areas that were hated in Russia, of course. So that has been now followed by what we have as de-Russification. And de-Russification means the removal of any Russian influences in Ukraine. It means, for example, removal of monuments to Russian literary figures. Why? Some liberals in the West might go, "Oh, this is terrible." Well, not really, because with every colonial empire, literary figures like Pushkin, Dostoevsky, and Lermontov and others, they were also propagators of Russian imperialism. They promoted Russian imperialism, and they promoted the chauvinistic view of Ukrainians. Now, so their monuments have been removed, their writings have been removed, Russian literature has been removed from Ukraine school curriculums, the Ukrainian language will be prioritized, other areas such as anything like Russian names. There are lots of streets in Ukraine named after Russian writers and Russian, even Tsarist generals, Soviet generals. They will all be renamed. Of course, this is a massive lot of work. We're talking hundreds of thousands of street names throughout Ukraine. But the process has begun, and I just do not see how this will not continue. The general opinion in Ukraine, the general feeling is that we've had Russia up to here now, and we're going to cut ourselves off from Russia. And this is felt in attitudes to how Ukrainians believe that relations with Russia will not improve in the near future. 50% of Ukrainians do not believe that relations with Russia will ever improve. This is a new opinion poll. Ever. Another sort of 25% believe that relations will improve, but it'll take 2 to 3 decades, not years, decades. So this is the general feeling of Ukrainians. They want nothing more to do with Russia. They want to basically build a complete wall between Russia and Ukraine. And of course, that also impacts on Ukrainians no longer wanting to read Russian books, watch Russian TV channels if they have a VPN because they're banned, but they can get around it, listen to Russian radio, Russian music. All of that has collapsed. All of that has gone down. And agreeing or committing yourself to speaking more in Ukrainian is a kind of a protest, saying, I understand that Ukrainian is part of my identity. Russian is a language spoken by those Russian soldiers, and I'm not gonna speak that language anymore. So the impact of this invasion and the crimes committed by Russia are going to be felt on Ukraine for decades to come, and that's no exaggeration. Russia managed to get to Kiev, but not in the way it wanted. Russian destroyed military equipment is lining the Krещатик today. So there were no parade uniforms. There was no repeat of Hitler's parade in Paris in 1940. there was just a parade of destroyed Russian military equipment. And the volume of destroyed Russian military equipment is just astounding. Russia has had to go cap in hand. Russia, this so-called great power, has had to go cap in hand to China and to Turkey, asking for military equipment. Both countries have denied, have refused to give Russia anything. Russia has now tried to get drones from Iran. Iran saying that it hasn't sold them or given them to Russia. We shall see. Never maybe can believe the Iranians. But this goes to show you to what degree the Ukrainians are literally kicking Russia's ass. So this is an incredible turnaround in only 6 months. From the beginning, when both the Kremlin and Western experts, so-called, and Western governments believed that Ukraine wouldn't survive longer than 2 to 3 days, to a situation where we have reached today, where Ukraine is the one on the offensive and Russia is the one on the defensive. And I'll just end by saying the options, the scenarios, there will never be a scenario of Ukrainian defeat. The reason for that is that Ukraine is in many ways today like Israel. It cannot allow itself to be defeated. If Israel is defeated, it believes there will be genocide, a second Holocaust of the Jewish people. If Ukraine is defeated, there would be a return to the Holodomor. There would be a return to Stalinist destruction and genocide of the Ukrainian people. We see this from the rhetoric and discourse of Russian leaders and Russian TV channels. They have adopted the fascist genocidal rhetoric that extreme fascists like Alexander Dugin were talking about 8 years ago. That is now mainstream. 2014, that was marginal. Now it's become mainstream. So Ukraine cannot afford and cannot allow itself to be defeated. Therefore, the only two options are stalemate, which has been the case in the last 6 weeks or so, with neither side making progress, or Ukraine being victorious. I believe that Ukraine will be victorious, and that Russia will be defeated, and that is why today I am drinking on Independence Day Putin Huilo, Putin dickhead beer from Lviv. It's the best beer you can drink on Independence Day in celebration of Ukraine's coming military victory. Cheers.